Inside this small ceramic jar, sealed with a cloth and a rubber band, is a sourdough starter my wife has been keeping alive for over 30 years. She feeds it flour and water twice a week, the way her mother taught her, the way her mother's mother did, before refrigerators existed, before supermarkets existed, before anyone had ever heard the word probiotic. I used to think it was just bread yeast, a quirky family habit. Then I started researching what is actually alive inside that jar, what it does to the food it touches, what happens to your body when that food disappears from your daily diet. And I realized my wife had been doing something that every single human civilization on Earth independently figured out was essential, long before any scientist understood why. And I realized something else. That what the processed food industry replaced it with, starting in the 1950s, is one of the most consequential dietary decisions in human history. The evidence is sitting in peer-reviewed research right now, and almost nobody is connecting it to what is happening inside you. Here is the thing that startled me when I first went through the history of fermentation. It was not one culture. It was not one region. It was not one tradition passed from one civilization to another through trade or conquest. Every human culture on Earth, independently, with zero contact with each other, arrived at the same answer. For instance, Korea developed kimchi, salted fermented vegetables, while Germany developed sauerkraut, salted fermented vegetables, and so many others spread across the world. The Journal of Ethnic Foods published a review in 2024 documenting that humans currently consume more than 5,000 distinct fermented food products worldwide. 5,000. From every raw material imaginable, on every continent, in every climate, across every economic class. That convergence is not coincidence. It is mathematics. Your ancestors did not ferment their food because they understood the gut microbiome. They fermented because it was the only reliable way to keep food from killing them. The health benefits came along for the ride. I found something interesting when I went through the research on what fermentation actually does to food at the biological level, because this is the part that genuinely changed how I think about everything I eat. Lactic acid bacteria, the organisms responsible for most traditional food fermentation, produce something called short-chain fatty acids during the fermentation process. These SCFAs, particularly butyrate, are now understood to be among the primary fuel sources for the cells lining your colon. They regulate inflammation. They support the integrity of the gut barrier. They communicate with your immune system. Research from multiple institutions has linked higher SCFA production in the gut to lower rates of inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers. But fermentation does something else I found even more remarkable. It pre-digests food. And then I found the detail that I believe is the most important single finding in this entire investigation. In 2016, the Sonnenburg laboratory at Stanford University published a study in the journal Nature. They had been feeding mice a diet low in microbiota-accessible carbohydrates, the dietary fiber and fermented compounds that gut bacteria feed on across multiple generations. What they found was not what they expected. Within a single generation, the microbiome diversity loss was largely reversible when diet was restored. But across multiple generations, something different happened. Species of gut bacteria were lost completely, not reduced, not suppressed, but permanently extinct within that lineage. And when dietary fiber and fermented foods were reintroduced to the fourth-generation mice, the lost species did not return. They were gone, and they could not come back. I processed that for a long time. The Sonnenburg research suggests that the dietary changes of the last several generations are not simply affecting the people who made them. They are potentially removing bacterial species from the human gut lineage permanently. Each generation that grows up without traditional fermented foods may be passing a slightly more impoverished microbiome to the next. That is not a theory about what might happen. That is what happened in a controlled laboratory, peer-reviewed, published in Nature. Now I need to tell you what happened to fermented food in the industrialized world. Because the story is specific and the timeline is tight. Before 1900, fermented foods were woven into the fabric of daily eating in every culture. Not as specialty items, not as health supplements, but as ordinary staples. Then, three things happened in sequence, each driven by industrial logic. The first was refrigeration. Commercial refrigeration became widely available from the 1870s onwards. By the mid-20th century, the domestic refrigerator was in virtually every American home. The original reason to ferment food, preservation without cold storage, had been replaced by a machine. Fermentation literacy began to disappear. The second was commercial baker's yeast. Developed and standardized in the late 19th century, commercial yeast made bread making fast, consistent, and industrially scalable. It replaced sourdough starters in virtually every commercial bakery. A fermentation process that took 12 to 24 hours was compressed into 90 minutes. The third was pasteurization, and what came after it. Pasteurization killed dangerous pathogens in dairy and solved a genuine public health crisis. But the same heat that killed Listeria and tuberculosis bacteria also killed the live cultures in yogurt, kefir, and aged cheese. Industrial dairy companies then had two choices. They could add live cultures back after pasteurization, which some did, producing what we now call probiotic yogurt. Or they could simply sell a heat-treated product with no live cultures at all, which is what most commercial dairy became. I went and looked at the sauerkraut on a supermarket shelf last week. I picked up 3 brands and read the labels. 2 of them listed vinegar as an ingredient. I want you to understand what that means. Traditional sauerkraut contains nothing but cabbage and salt. The fermentation produces its own acid. Vinegar is added to industrial sauerkraut to mimic the sour taste of fermentation without actually fermenting anything. The product has been heat treated to kill whatever bacteria might have developed. The jar contains no living organisms. It contains no SCFAs. It contains no probiotic benefit of any kind. It is pickled cabbage dressed up in the packaging of a fermented food. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire point. Professor Tim Spector at King's College London has spent years building one of the largest dietary microbiome databases in the world through the Zoe Research Project, a study involving over 34,000 participants published in Nature in December 2025. What that research shows, consistently and reproducibly, is that what you eat is directly and rapidly linked to which bacteria live in your gut and how abundant they are. The research he and his colleagues have produced confirms what the Sonnenburg lab showed in mice. Western gut microbiomes have around 15 to 30% fewer bacterial species than those of people living traditional, non-industrialized lifestyles. I found a study comparing the gut microbiomes of Ba'aka pygmies in Central Africa, a hunter-gatherer population eating a traditional diet including fermented foods, with their neighboring Bantu agriculturist community that had partially adopted a modern diet. The Ba'aka had significantly greater gut microbiome diversity, not marginally, significantly. And a study comparing Papua New Guinean rural populations with U.S. residents found not just different diversity levels, but entirely different compositional profiles. Bacteria present in Papua New Guinean guts that are simply absent from American ones. Not lower in number, absent. I kept asking myself, what are those bacteria doing that ours are not? I started making my own yogurt from whole milk, raw where I can get it, pasteurized where I cannot, with a tablespoon of live culture yogurt as a starter, incubated overnight. It costs a fraction of what commercial probiotic yogurt costs and contains a far greater diversity of live organisms. And I started reading sauerkraut labels. If it contains vinegar, I put it back. If it contains only cabbage and salt, I buy it. The difference in the refrigerated section is real and available at most grocery stores. It just requires reading the ingredients rather than trusting the packaging. None of these things require equipment, specialist knowledge, or significant money. They require the willingness to do what every human civilization managed to do before a machine offered to do it for them. And so the processed food industry replaced that jar with commercial yeast, pasteurization, and a splash of vinegar. They did not do it to harm anyone. They did it because industrial scale demanded consistency, and fermentation is beautifully, stubbornly inconsistent. But the Sonnenburg lab showed us what happens when you take fermented food away from an organism across successive generations. The species do not come back. I think about that every time I feed the starter. Please let me know in the comments. Did you grow up with any fermented food in your household? Yogurt, pickles, sourdough, kimchi, anything? And when did it disappear from your table?